Well, first of all, good morning, everyone. As Paul mentioned, my name is Yan Cui, and I've been a long-time user for AWS. I've been running stuff in production in AWS for about 10 years now, and as of last year, they also made me one of their serverless heroes because I do a lot of work for the AWS community itself, both in terms of recent content, but also in terms of video courses and public speaking and so on and whatnot. The last couple of years, I've been working primarily with serverless technologies, and by that, I really mean the AWS Lambda. And one of the things I worked on was, and I talked about last year, was this thing I did migrating a social network to serverless, and you can read more about that with a link down below. And right now, nowadays, I actually split my time between working with Lumigo as a developer advocate, where I'm trying to help them build a serverless troubleshooting platform that make it easier for you to observe and also troubleshoot any problems that you find in your serverless application. And the other half of my time I spent consulting independently with a bunch of different customers, helping them adopt best practices when it comes to serverless, but also figure out where does it fit, where does serverless fit within the overall architecture, as well as in terms of the workloads they have as well. And one of the things that we often talk about in these meetings is security. And the interesting thing about serverless when it comes to security is that if you look at the shared responsibility model, with serverless, AWS is now essentially taking over more responsibility for the security of your operating system, the firewall configuration, and so on and so forth, which is generally speaking good news for us because AWS can typically do a much better job in terms of patching the operating system, the AMIs, and so on than most of us can do ourselves. So we get better protection against attacks against the operating system. Things such as WannaCry or Spectre or Meltdown. In fact, when the whole Spectre and Meltdown thing was announced publicly, I remember very clearly that me and the team that I was working with at the time, we were still trying to patch, I think, about 50 different AMIs we have for different clusters. And when I saw a tweet from Chris Munns from AWS saying that all the clusters running Fargate and Lambda has been patched globally against Spectre and Meltdown. And then it hit me that that's one of the superpowers you get when you can offload some of the security for your operating system to the provider. However, we are still responsible for the security of our own code, our application code, as well as any dependencies that we have in terms of libraries and third-party tools and so on. And when you look at OWASP Top 10, which is the top 10 risk against the web applications, very little has changed since about 2010 to the most recent one we got last year. And when the guys from Sneak looked at the top 10 data breaches that happened in 2016, they found that a quarter of them was caused by applications using components, libraries, and so on that has got a known vulnerability. And when they looked at the top, I think 5,000 websites on Alexa, not the Alexa you have in your kitchen, but an index of the top websites in the world, they also found that over nearly 80% of them was using at least one JavaScript library that has some known vulnerability. When you think about it, this sounds pretty scary, but when you look at the data more closely, you realize that, well, it turns out even some of the biggest libraries that we have, things like React and jQuery, at some point in time, they had some known vulnerabilities that was quickly patched, but it's still up to you to make sure that you upgrade to the latest versions and have the latest security patches and so on. And if you're using libraries like user agent to pass user agent, then at some point in time, you are also vulnerable to regex denial of service attacks as well. And the interesting thing is even when you go to Lambda, if you're using a relational database, you're still vulnerable to attacks such as the SQL injection attack because just because you're connecting to a relational database from a Lambda function, it doesn't mean that the attacker can't exploit how you communicate with the database. So if you're taking user input as they are, and then string concatenate into your SQL query, then you are still going to be open to SQL injection attacks. And turns out, even if you're using no SQL databases, for example, if you're using MongoDB, the MongoDB's query syntax still allows the attackers to do injection attacks against your MongoDB queries. Arguably, if you're using something like DynamoDB from AWS, the API is much more restrictive, which also means that you're far less likely for attackers to launch any kind of injection attacks, at least one that I know of. So the moral of the story here is that doesn't matter whether or not your application is is running on Lambda, VMs, or containers, you should always use the prepare statement when you're working with relational databases. And as a rule of thumb, you should always sanitize the input for your application as well as the output, because security is as much about what your application, or in this case, what your function should do, as well as what it shouldn't do. We've seen time and time again, attackers are able to orchestrate injection attacks and then extract data from the application that should never have been returned in the first place. So make sure that you also sanitize the output from your functions. Another thing that has been really gaining popularity is GraphQL, and it turns out even GraphQL is not, I guess, is still vulnerable to injection attack of different forms. And when you think about it, it does make sense, because ultimately your GraphQL query still gets transformed into SQL queries if you're using a relational database behind the scenes. So it's still possible for the attacker to manipulate those queries so that they can execute the injection attacks. And then there's also a library that potentially uses the JavaScript, the eval under the hood, which then opens you to being vulnerable to code injection attacks as well. And the thing I find with a lot of these third-party dependencies that we have is that unlike a lot of the patches you get for the operating system, which comes from a known entity, a trusted entity like your Microsoft or Apple, and then they comes in standalone forms that you can apply, for a lot of these dependencies that we have for applications, usually the patches come with some other changes, which could be new features, or it could be even breaking API changes and so on. So this hit me a few times whereby I upgrade to the latest version to get the security patches I want, but then in doing so, I open myself up to other security vulnerabilities that were discovered later on, or other bugs in the new version of the libraries. So the moral of the story here is that your application dependencies is likely to be a much bigger attack surface than you realize. Because firstly, there's your dependencies, the dependencies that you actively pull down from, say, NPM or from Maven, depending on your language ecosystem. But then there's the dependencies for your dependencies, or the transient dependencies. And if you look at any number of NPM packages out there, you will find a very deeply nested graph, a dependency graph for that dependency. So much so that it's become a bit of an internet meme that no one dares look into what's actually happening inside the NPM, the no modules folder, because you're just going to open up a whole worm, a can of worm that you wish you hadn't. So trying to manage and update all of these dependencies is, of course, not going to be possible, not feasible in terms of how manually labor intensive it is. That's why tools such as Snyk is really important, as in terms of automating all these checks, whether or not your dependencies have got known vulnerabilities against them, and if there are a known fix, also then try to automate the process of patching those dependencies. And Snyk also has got built integration with Lambda functions so that they can scan your Lambda function code actively so that they can find any known vulnerabilities and alert you quickly. But as I mentioned before, there's this difficulty of patching dependencies because they often don't come in a standalone form. And also, with a lot of open source projects, you find that once the open source author has lost his interest, oftentimes those dependencies just remain idle and dormant and with no updates and so on. And your security is only as strong as its weakest link. And as an attacker, when I look at your application, I might see something like this, where you have the physical infrastructure that's secure and protected by AWS, possibly with armed guards patrolling the place 24/7. There's your application, and then there's a dependency for your application, and so on. And if we are, in terms of figuring out how do I and where do I attack your application, and if we're making a movie, a AAA blockbuster, then by far and away, that is where I'm going to attack. I'm going to attack the physical infrastructure just so that I can hang down from the ceiling like Tom Cruise, and then hack into some computer I've never seen before, probably using a language that I've never seen before, which of course makes sense. And then, of course, in the real world, well, why would I even want to go anywhere near some remote location where it's protected by armed guards when I can just attack your application when there are so many low-hanging fruits? I can quickly scan application to see whether or not they have injection attack vulnerabilities and so on. And turns out the humans are also often the weakest link in the entire security chain. I don't know how many of you have seen this TV show, Mr. Robot. If you haven't, make it the first thing you do when you get home tonight. The interesting thing you see with Mr. Robot is that it's by far the most realistic depiction of what hackers actually do. And one of the things you notice in the show is that most of the time, the hackers are not trying to hack into a computer system. Instead, they're doing things like social engineering, and they'll be recording some program with viruses on a USB stick and drop it on the floor, just outside police stations, so that one of the policemen will pick it up. Oh, look, free USB. Plug into the computer, and voila, to get access to the system. And so our users is often vulnerable to all kinds of social engineering attacks, such as phishing and so on and so forth. And then your developers yourselves, you're also vulnerable to potentially having your GitHub account being compromised, so that the attacker, if they can gain access to your GitHub account, unless you look at a source code for your application, then they can find out all kind of information they would need to really understand how your application works, but also importantly, how to attack it. Now, hopefully, most of you are doing the right thing. You're using multi-factor authentication with GitHub, and you're using strong passwords and so on. But turns out there's another group of people that I can attack very effectively, and those are the authors for the dependencies that you have. And turns out a lot of them, they don't pay nearly as much attention to the NPM account as they do to their own source code. And this happened about 2 years ago when a white-hat security researcher managed to gain published access to 14% of all NPM packages that include the likes of React, Request, Express, Jasmine, Electron, and so on and so forth, which in total accounted for about 20% of the monthly downloads from NPM. Now, that is a scary number. That means 1 in 5 packages that any of us download from NPM could have been compromised without us knowing, because an attacker with a published access could have published a malicious version to NPM. And also the thing, when it gets worse, is that the security researcher didn't do anything super sophisticated. It wasn't rocket science or anything. He was using a combination of brute force, as well as combining with known account leaks from other places to gain access to most of these accounts. And when you look at his finding afterwards, the reading doesn't look great, because something like 1,000 of developers would protect the NPM account with, what can you say, weak passwords. I mean, surely as developers, we know not to use passwords like 123 and password or 12345, but clearly, I think this shows the attitude many of us have towards NPM, where, well, it's just not our own application code, so we don't need to pay as much attention to make sure that our NPM account is secure. And that's just not great, right? When there's so much of the ecosystem depends on many of these open source projects and NPM packages. And the thing with Lambda is that when you look at the execution environment for your Lambda function, one of the things you'll find are environment variables for AWS region, security key, and session token in plain text, i.e. everything I would need as an attacker to be able to assume the IAM permission, the IAM role for your Lambda function, and then probe your account. So I was trying to find out how easy can someone actually launch an attack like this and get and steal your credentials. So I published an NPM package, and I was really concerned about someone actually download this. So I took the precaution and named a package "Do not download this package." And when I looked at the package a week later, now you see where the problem is, right? So I looked at the package a week later, and I found I got over 200 downloads, which sadly is way more. It's about 100 times more than the downloads I got for another package that I published, which is actually a useful utility tool. Really sad moment for me. So what this NPM package does is, before it does anything, in the initialization, it grabs your environment variables and then publish it and post it to a HTTP endpoint I've set up. And that HTTP endpoint, of course, is set up with Lambda, with API gateway in front of it, where I will look for anything that looks like AWS credentials. And if I find them, I'm going to publish it to a SNS topic with my email subscribed to it, so that I get a nice email with a little command line thing I can run in the console to assume that permission, and then voila, I was able to list my S3 buckets because that's the permission that my function had. So that took me about 15 minutes to actually orchestrate and set it up. So way too easy for my liking. And then I try to see, okay, well, what if it's a transit dependency? It's not a direct dependency. So I published another package called do not download this package neither. And of course, no one heard my message, and I got another 100 downloads or so in the first week. And sadly, transient packages also work the same way because, again, if your dependency has got dependency on something, and then everything gets initialized in some kind of a chain, then of course that code that steals your credentials will still run. But turns out I was wrong. I was trying to go a really long way to get to the end result, and someone had a much better idea than I did. So why try to compromise someone's NPM account just so they can publish a malicious version of their packages when you can just publish another NPM package with a similar name to the real thing? So this happened in the real life in 2017, where someone published an NPM package. There's a legit package called cross-env. So someone published something called cross_env, and then people was downloaded them by mistake. And what this package was doing was stealing people's environment variables. And so it was quickly noticed by I don't know how quickly, but it was noticed by someone, reported to NPM, and the whole user's NPM package was shut down. But the attacker wasn't even being subtle. Look at his NPM handle, hack task. I think there's a clue there that maybe we shouldn't download packages from someone whose NPM handle has got hack in the name. But there's other things you can do as well, which is equally bad with NPM, whereby I guess that they fixed it now, but NPM install used to let you run a post-install script. Actually, maybe they still haven't, which you can just do some pretty amazing things to someone's laptop if you run some awful, some malicious script at the end of it. And these kind of attacks may sound hypothetical, but they actually happen a lot in real life if you spend some time to look into all the different cases that's been reported publicly. Another thing that really concerns me when it comes to NPM is that when you run npm install, you get this little caret sign at on the version of your package in the package.json. What it means is that the next time you run npm install, NPM is going to install the most up-to-date version that is compatible with the version that you have there, not the exact version. So when I go to commit my code, I push it, goes to the PI, it gets built on the server, on the CI server. I could have installed a slightly different version to the version that I have tested locally. So instead of version 1.0.0, npm install could have installed version 1.0.1, which is a version that could have been published by a malicious attacker. So that's not great. There's things that can happen on a CI server that introduces potentially subtle differences between what we have tested locally to what gets deployed to AWS, but also potentially we can install a malicious version without knowing. So the morale here is that you should try to use npm string wrap, or at least in the CI environment, use npm CI instead of npm install, which will try to restore the exact version you had in your package.lock JSON file. I know I'm kind of picking on NPM here. I've been talking about all the example I talked about is from NPM. That's just because NPM and Node.js is probably the biggest ecosystem we have. But I have spent a lot of my career working with .NET, and also in recent years working with the JVM as well. And the same challenges with package management exist for all these different language ecosystems. You can look at your Maven file. You can find all kinds of dependencies that you didn't even know you have. And in fact, with Node.js and Python, at least you can look at a file, a JavaScript file, and really quickly see what it's doing. You can't even do that with Java or .NET dependencies because they are compiled. So if you want to see what those dependencies are actually doing, you have to decompile them first. So assuming that you can't, there's only so much you can do to try to block the attacker out. And in this case, the attacker is able to get into our systems from the dependencies and so on. What can we do now to protect ourselves? This is where identity and access management comes in, where you can control who can invoke your functions, but more importantly, what can your function actually access in your environment. And this is where you want to practice the principle of least privilege, which is that's what it says on the tin, whereby you want to give your application, or in this case your Lambda functions, the least amount of permission it needs to do its job and nothing more. And here I find some common patterns, some common mistakes people make, whereby they spend a lot of time trying to harden around the network layer, where you've got your firewall settings, you've got your public-facing VPC for your public-facing APIs, and then you have your private VPC for applications or systems, APIs and so on, that should only be accessed by your own APIs, your public-facing APIs, and then you set up VPC tunnel and all of that good stuff. Now the problem comes is that we spend a lot of time blocking traffic out from the ingress, and then everything that's in the VPC is assumed to be safe, is full trust environment, that once you're inside VPC, you can access everything because you're one of the good guys. However, as we just talked about, attackers can get into your system from the side door through your dependencies. They're not going through the front door trying to knock down the VPC, so the ingress routes. They're going to get into the application from the side and steal sensitive data from you. And that's actually what happened with Capital One, whereby one of the ex-Amazon employees was scanning people's firewall configurations, find customers who are not doing egress filtering, so that once they're able to get in, they can steal any data they want and then send them out to their own malicious endpoints collecting those data. And one thing that we see more and more is AWS credentials being stolen and then being used to mine Bitcoins. Now, with Lambda, like most other AWS services, it's always public, so anyone can actually anyone who knows your ARN can try to call your function. But luckily, access is actually controlled by IAM service, so just because I know where it is doesn't mean that I can actually do anything with it because it's protected by IAM. But as we just mentioned, well, someone can still gain through the dependencies and try to steal data. So one of the companies in the serverless security space called PureSec, they publish a free library called Function Shield, which is endorsed by me. What they can do is Function Shield can block any egress traffic to public internet while still allow your function to talk to AWS services. But anytime it sees a function trying to talk to public internet, it's going to block that. Another thing you could do is that you can put your function inside VPC, set up egress filtering with your security group and so on, which is great. But right now, there's still a problem with Lambda running in VPC in that you're going to see a 10-second cold start from time to time. The good news is that Amazon is working hard to actually remove that cold start penalty for Lambda function running in VPC. And right now, I think there's the Frankfurt region is fully patched for this VPC change, so that when your function runs inside a VPC, there's no additional penalty for the 10 seconds. And they're in the process of rolling out to Ireland and then other regions after that. Another thing we see is that, well, because it's full trust environment, so that any application that's runs inside your public VPC can now access everything in all your private your APIs, which is again is a attack surface that attackers can exploit. So even for your internal API, you should leverage the fact that you can implement the authentication and authorization using IAM. This is especially easy when you're building stuff with API Gateway and Lambda, because you can implement you can use IAM to implement authentication and authorization with API Gateway, and if you're using something like the server framework, it's essentially just a one-liner change to actually do that. And you also want to minimize the amount of access that each function has, and as part of that, you want to create one policy for every function that's tailored to just what that function needs to do. So if you've got an API with 4 different endpoints for your CRUD, then the get function that supports the get endpoint should have its own policy that just allows the function to read from database and doesn't give you write access to the same data. With the server framework, it's kind of clumsy to do that natively, but there's a plugin that allows you to do this really easily, which again, just a few lines of code to implement the per function policies. That's all well and good, but one of the things I find with this doing this by hand is that it requires a lot of developer discipline, and we know from history that any time it requires people to be disciplined to do the right thing all the time, you are going to fail, because as humans, we are just really bad at following the same process, doing the same thing over and over every single time. That's why I think it's really good that a lot of vendors in this space, people like PureSec and Protego, are offering you commercial tools that allows you to, as part of your CI pipeline, scan the application code, see how your code is using the AWS CK, so that it figures out what permissions your function should have, compares against the permission you actually give your function to say, oh, you're over-permissioning for this function. So maybe you should try this instead, then generate a template that you can use. And since your Lambda functions are ephemeral, they go away, they scale to 0 when there's no traffic, so you also have to put your user data somewhere. You can't put them inside the function and hope that they will survive the next garbage collection, which means that we're going to be using an awful lot of different data sources to hold our data, and we need to make sure that any data that we're holding for users, any sensitive data, are encrypted both at rest as well as in transit. The good news is that more and more of AWS services support server-side encryption out of the box. Many years ago, they introduced the server-side encryption to S3, and then they introduced it to the RDS and the Kinesis Stream, and more recently, DynamoDB now also supports the server-side encryption as well, so that you can ask AWS to look after the encryption for you. And you still want, excuse me. So you allow your function the least amount of privilege and access to data as necessary, but then also make sure that the data is encrypted once it's in the data source. Another thing you hear a lot is this idea that, well, once your function is no longer necessary, you should delete them, because otherwise they're going to hang around and stay around as an attack surface that attackers can potentially exploit. And this is, in fact, one of the recommendations in the official best practices guide for Lambda from AWS. What I find, though, however, is in practice, this is often easier said than done, because especially in a large organization, trying to find ownership for different application components can be quite challenging, especially as priorities change, applications change, people move around, people leave the company. And this is especially true when it comes to serverless, whereby you now have to identify ownership, not for individual components, but for individual functions. Which is why I think you should really do yourself a favor and tag every function with some useful tags to help identify ownership easily. So I would tag every single project with the team name, and I do that at the CloudFormation level, so that it gets propagated to all of my functions as part of that project. But also at the same time tag things like cost center, feature, I don't know, division, maybe dev center if it applies. So that when someone looks at my functions and see, okay, it hasn't been used for a while, is it still necessary? Should we delete it? Then at least they can quickly find out who's the right person to speak to. And then, of course, there's the denial of service attack risk that we have. With Lambda, things auto scales based on traffic, so you're actually more likely to just brute force your way through a denial of service attack. However, because you're going to be paying for every single request, so it's still a problem, it's just a slightly different format. So now in the service world, we call denial of service attacks the denial of wallet attack, because someone can cause you to spend a lot of money on API Gateway and Lambda for those invocations. Which is why it's important for you to still implement the rate limiting. You can do that through WAF on both API Gateway and CloudFront, where you can implement the IP level rate limiting. But again, that's only good for, I guess, attacks from a script kiddie, where everything's coming from one IP. But when you're talking about truly distributed denial of service attack from many IPs, maybe potentially from a botnet, those WAF configurations are not going to really help you too much. So it's still important for you to implement the rate limiting at API Gateway level. So API Gateway does allow you to implement rate limiting for both the API stage, but also for individual endpoints. However, the default settings when you publish a new API in API Gateway has got rate limit equals to the rate limit for your entire region. So what that means is that as an attacker, all I need to do is find one publicly accessible endpoint, deny a service attack against that single endpoint, and potentially consume all your requests per second that's allowed in the whole region, and take down not just that one API, but all of the APIs that you're running in the same region. So it's important for you to review those default settings once you publish a new API. There's also AWS Shield, which gives you basic protection against the network layer attacks, against the Amazon infrastructure. And if you pay, I think, $3,000 per month, you also get AWS Shield Advanced, which gives you access to Amazon's DDoS response team, when which is very useful expertise to tap into when you're under attack. And it also gives you payment protection against extra costs you incur when you're under attack for ELB, CloudFront, and Route 53, but not for any application level resources like EC2 or Lambda. Another thing with Lambda is that when you're dealing with async invocations, say for example, you publish something to SNS and triggers the Lambda function, or you drop a file into S3 and that triggers the Lambda function, those async invocations has got built-in retries, 2 retry out of the box, which, as the opportunity guys found, can actually go up to as many as 6 retry invocations. So imagine if someone is able to launch a denial of service attack against you. Potentially, you're allowing users to drop files into S3, and then you process them, and then the attacker is then dropping invalid files into S3 that causes your function to run for a long time potentially, and then fail. So you retry, and if you can combine that with a function that has got a long timeout, then someone can really start to magnify the magnitude of the financial impact they can have against your system. And when that happens, well, you're going to be losing a lot of money potentially. So one of the things you also do is make sure that when you configure the timeout for your Lambda functions, you apply sensible timeouts. So for APIs, don't even bother having something more than, say, 3 to 6 seconds. But for background processing, be really conscious about how long was the upper limit for those invocations, so that you don't have function that has got a really long timeout unnecessarily. Another thing you want to do is set up alerts so that you alert yourself when the rate of error, not the error count, which is easily skewed based on the amount of traffic you have, but error rate is much more reliable alert you can set up, so that if, say, the number of invocations, say 90% of invocations is fine, but 10% is failing, then something's up. And before, we used to have all these application servers that we were running, that over time, there's a lot of them that hang around for a very long time and eventually become infested with viruses, and with Lambda or Serverless, many other service functional service things, we don't have to manage the servers anymore. One of the good things we get is that now we don't have these long-lived servers who are compromised and act as a Trojan horse into our ecosystem. However, even Lambda functions reuse something. So when AWS sees that, okay, there's a new request coming in, I don't have a container that is free, so I'm going to create a new container to run your code, and that creates a cold start invocation. But after that, that container gets reused on subsequent invocations, and your function has got a temp folder as well, which means that if you put anything sensitive into the temp folder, then potentially attackers can then also get access to that data as well. So another thing the function shield free library can do for you, which is available for both JavaScript and Python, is also you can disable the read and writes to the temp folder. And as a best practice, you should try to avoid using the temp folder anyway. Another thing that we have depending on for a very long time are all these different web frameworks. And one of the things these web frameworks let you do is enable directory listing. And sometimes people forget to disable them when it goes to production. And one of the top OWASP risks is accidental data exposure. And in fact, if you go to Google right now and you can search for things like, web.config or app.config, and you find many applications web.config exposed publicly because they forgot to disable directory listing. And in some of this web.config, you can actually find credentials and URLs, an IP address to databases with credentials in plain text. In fact, if you look for it, you can even find production dump for production databases right there in the public internet, because again, people forgot to disable directory listing. So with Lambda, by and large, you don't need to use any of these web frameworks anymore. And one of the sort of benefit that you get with that is things like directory listing. It's just not something that you can actually enable unless you specifically implement for it. And as of now, I haven't seen any company that actually wanted to implement directory listing. Another thing I want to talk about is Bitcoins, or specifically what is called cryptojacking, whereby attackers will steal your credentials and then try to, well, it doesn't have to be AWS, but they try to run Bitcoin mining on your compute resources. And this has happened to many, many people. If you look on the internet, you'll find many stories about how developers accidentally left their AWS credentials in the public repo and then waking up to a massive bill from AWS. And for every case that you can actually read on the internet, you can bet that there are many, many more cases that have not been reported because companies just do not want to look stupid or incompetent. In fact, just within the people that I know very well, at least 2 companies have suffered from this, whereby someone forgot to filter the AWS credentials. Code commit was pushed to a public repo, and then the attacker was able to get the AWS credentials that way. Because even if you remove them, GitHub keeps track of all the histories of commits, so those credentials are still going to be in history somewhere. So you have to rewrite the entire history for your repo to get rid of that. When I was trying to research this problem, a much better solution I found was to actually use Git pre-commit hooks, so that before you actually allow a commit to go through, you run a simple script that looks for any string that looks like, say, your AWS credentials, and then stop the commit if you find them. Another thing you could do within AWS, you can monitor activities in regions that you shouldn't be running anything. And from my friends at AWS, what they tell me is that Sao Paulo and I think Tokyo are the 2 hotbeds for attackers to launch cryptojacking. So once they got someone's credentials, they tend to create EC2 instances to do Bitcoin mining in those regions, because not many people are actually using those regions. So that if you're not using Sao Paulo, chances are you're not going to go to the console, go to Sao Paulo and see whether or not you've got any EC2 instances running. So use AWS events, CloudWatch events to monitor those activities. And then you can also, when you have multiple accounts, CloudWatch events also allows you to do cross-account delivery, so that you can do all your monitoring and alerting in one centralized account, but collecting information from all these different accounts. You can also set up billing alarms as well if you have regions that you shouldn't be using. And one of the last thing we want to talk about, and as we're running out of time, is this idea of bulkheads, where ship makers have been using for many, many years to compartmentalize breaches, which has also become a popular application-level paradigm thanks to the book by Michael Nygaard, where in terms of bulkheads, we can have least privilege for individual functions, and then we can have per-function policies. But I think also very important to have some isolation at the AWS account level, so that your production account, your production workload doesn't run in the same account as your dev workload, so that if someone does compromise at least your dev account, they don't get access to your production user data. So quickly recap, we talked about application dependencies being a much bigger attack surface than we realized, and we talked about how OWASP is still as relevant as before, and that you should sanitize the input and output from your functions, and that you should apply the least privilege principle, and make sure that every function has got a tailored permission policy just for what it needs to do, and then encrypt all your data, both at rest as well as in transit. And if you know a function is no longer necessary, delete it straight away. But keep in mind that in our service attack is still relevant to Lambda functions, and that with AWS Shield, you do get some coverage, but it doesn't give you coverage for the cost for Lambda. Servers tend to get the infested viruses, so no server means no long-lived compromised servers in the environment, but we can still be victims of cryptojacking, so make sure that you protect your AWS credentials with care, and try to put some bulkheads in terms of the account level isolation. And remember that humans tend to be still the weakest link in our entire security chain. And with that, thank you guys very much for your time. And I guess we should look at the slide.
Yeah, we have a bunch of questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
This one?
Q&A tab.
Okay, Q&A tab. Okay,
yeah,
there you go.
So let's start with the most upvoted ones. So the first question is that secure, that someone is able to make statistic like how many users have password like 1, 2, 3, 4?
5, 6. That is a good question. So there's nothing built in to do that. But one of the things you could do So for example, if you're building an API that's authenticating an actual user from the website, for example, you can use Amazon Cognito, which gives you a number of hooks that you can run Lambda functions. So one of the things you could do is this guy called Troy Hunt, he's published his, I guess, a database of known password leaks, so that you can use that as database. And when you see a customer trying to use a password that hashes to one of the sort of known leaks out there, then tell the customer that, hey, please choose a different password because this password is available on the internet somewhere, so someone might be able to use that to try to attack, to get into your account. So it's not built-in secure, but you can actually do that relatively easily.
Okay, thank you. The next question is how to protect against NPM packages that might have been published by an attacker who compromised our account.
There's not much you can actually do, especially when you can't manually scan all your dependencies and check every single one of them. And even if you did, chances are that particular version is going to look like legitimate because it's going to come from the actual public author's NPM account. What you can do, though, is trying to set up things like Greenkeeper and a few others so that when there's a new version, so once the compromise has been identified and removed, a new version has been, has been published, then you can use something like Greenkeeper or Sneak to try to be more proactive in terms of updating your dependencies to a newer version.
Okay, maybe the last question. So does Sneak and NPM audit share the same vulnerabilities database?
I think yes. One of the things that Sneak does is they publish their security, their vulnerability database as a service to people like GitHub and NPM, so that a lot of these vulnerabilities you find in this with NPM audit, for example, and from GitHub actually comes from a database that Sneak manages and publishes. So that's one side of the business. The other side is the commercial tool for you to then be more proactive in terms of finding vulnerabilities and applying patches.
Okay. That will be all. So please give Yan again warm applause.
Thank you.